Good afternoon, everyone, and a very warm welcome to our 18th William Pitt Seminar. And this is a rather wonderful moment because it is the first William Pitt Seminar that we will have done in this magical new auditorium. The very first one was in the Nihon room in the chapel side of the college. The second one was in the old library, but we then grew and grew over the years. And after those first 2 years, we had to go begging round other colleges to have a space big enough for us to host the seminar in. So it is a wonderful moment for us to be back here in Pembroke in our own auditorium, and a big welcome to you all for it. Just one or two housekeeping things first. We're not expecting any fire alarms. If one sounds, please follow the fire exit signage and instructions from Pembroke staff who are dotted around. If you go out through the foyer where you gathered initially, then the gathering point is in the courtyard outside by the stone benches. The seminar will start with presentations from our speakers, followed by a discussion between the speakers, moderated by Pam Garside, our wonderful chair. And there will then be a short break with tea and coffee available outside, followed by a question and answer session with the chance for everyone in the room and following online to ask their questions. We will try and manage to answer as many questions as we can before bringing things to a close. The seminar will be recorded up to the break, and the recording will be made available on the college website after the event. There will also be a news article, and please look out for the blog, which Julia Bird, one of our speakers, has very kindly agreed to draft after the seminar. Anyone from the online audience who wants to ask a question, please do so through the chat function at any time. And Kate, our wonderful corporate partnership organizer, will ask questions on your behalf during the question and answer session. Participants can also follow the William Pitt Seminar online on Twitter using the hashtag WPS 2023, or can follow us on @CorpPembroke or @Pembroke 1347. We like to celebrate contemporaneity and history at the same time. The William Pitt Seminar is an annual event. It's organized by the Corporate Partnership Program, and a big thank you to both Kate and Michael, who run the Corporate Partnership Program, for doing so brilliantly yet again. The Corporate Fellows choose the topic for the seminar. The future of health theme was one that we thought was becoming increasingly important, and I'm thrilled that we have such a wonderful lineup of speakers to introduce the subject for us. And I'm particularly thrilled to be able to introduce our chair, for the afternoon, Pam Garside. Pam has had a career in healthcare systems and digital health in the UK and internationally. She's an angel investor in early stage health tech companies. She's a fellow of the Judge Business School here in Cambridge. She's a member of the investment committee of Cambridge Enterprise, the technology transfer company of the university. Pam founded and co-chairs the Cambridge Health Network. She's chair of Cambridge Angels, and she sits on the board of Crown Place Venture Capital Trust. She advises a number of life science companies, health technology accelerators, and startups in the UK and Europe. So, Pam, a formidable CV.
Thank you.
Thank you very much for being our chair for the afternoon, and over to you.
Right. Thank you, Chris. Could you introduce me more often, please? I like that. So thank you. I'd like to add my welcome to the Masters. And to live and let die, how will society adapt when we all live longer? Now, William Pitt died, does anybody know how old he was, don't you say? When he died, 46. And he died of liver disease, they think due to overconsumption of port and similar. But that was 5.5 years longer than the average life expectancy in 1806. And now, are there any 18, 19-year-olds here? Are there any young students? Oh, look, they're all in a bunch. You will, if you're born today as a baby in the UK, you get to about 80 as a male, 83 as a female. You're probably a bit less than that, but not far off. But this will rise. And we know there'll be a lot of 100-year-old babies being born about now. But currently, 23% of that long lifespan is defined as not in good health. And so when people say to me, would you like to be 120? And I go, oh, no. And I think a lot of people are my age, I'll say in our 60s, think, because I think it's the large majority of over 65s have 3 chronic diseases. I can tell you what mine are later. So we're degenerating. And so we're living longer lives, not necessarily better. But the 2 richest men in the world have invested in this area. And I know we're going to hear a bit more about Altos Labs. So Jeff Bezos has put billions into Altos Labs as one of the labs in Cambridge. And that's about reversing aging if possible. And then Elon Musk has founded Neuralink on the West Coast in California that's looking at neurodegenerative diseases. And I think that's good. I actually think it's better than rockets. But then on the more woo-woo end of the spectrum, the wellness industry has an awful lot in this area. They're mostly strangers to any evidence or science, but can't be ignored because a lot of people spend money on it. So we're here to talk about all the issues thrown up by the trends that you'll hear from our very distinguished panel, who I will now introduce. And first up is Julia. Julia Bird is an alumna of the college, an economist who currently works as an independent consultant with expertise in sustainable economic development. So over to you, Julia.
Thank you. So I'm going to begin with a quote from a film which came out last year and appeared at the Cannes Festival in 2022. The surplus of seniors is draining Japan's economy and taking a heavy toll on the young generation. That opening line of that film is really epitomizing what Japan is already seeing and what many economies are seeing across the more developed world in recent years and in years that are ahead of us. The increasingly large and often costly elderly population is bearing a weight on the wider economy. The film continues. Surely the elderly don't wish to be a blight on our lives. That film, Plan 75, if any of you have seen it, is somewhat dystopian. I'll explain to you the premise and how it continues. To address this issue in Japan, which is leading to a rise in hate crimes as people attack the elderly for draining the resources from their lives, the government introduces a new scheme in which, at the age of 75, receiving $1,000 from the government that you can spend as you wish, you then agree to die. As I said, it's somewhat dystopian. But what happens next in that film, I think, is quite insightful. We proceed into a world where connection becomes more and more relevant to the audience and more relevant to the people in the film. And we recognize also the loneliness in many people's lives. The call center worker whose role is to speak to an elderly person who's preparing for this death becomes attached to the person that she's speaking to and is beginning to doubt the process that she's involved in. Someone else finds his uncle and sees how this is in fact affecting him and begins to doubt that this is really what he wants his society to look like. Because while the plan is voluntary, once you take away all of those aspects that support the elderly and make them feel valued in society, then the elderly themselves start to feel not worthwhile. And while the plan is voluntary, it becomes in some degree a coercive plan. So what is the value of life? And what is the value of an ever longer life? Now, as an economist, I think I'm often criticized for needing to value and measure everything. We cannot, of course, do so. But in a world of scarce resources, where we have limited money, we need to think and make some judgments. Where are we going to spend it? How are we going to deal with this? Now, many of you will know the term the dependency ratio. And what that does is it's a very blunt statistic, but it tells us how many people there are in a given country or globally between the ages of 0 to 14 and 65 plus, as a ratio to the size of the working population, those between 15 and 65. As I said, it's quite blunt, but it does tell us quite starkly what is happening and the changes we're seeing. In Europe, in 2010, that ratio was such that we had one person aged 65 plus to every 4 working adult. By 2050, the UN population statistics estimates suggest that that's going to be one person aged 65 plus to every 2 working adults. We're going to see a fundamental change to our society. We've got fewer young people, declining fertility rates, and far greater numbers of old people who are living longer and living hopefully healthier lives. What does this mean? So, as I said, an economist's role is to manage resources, and surely an economist's favorite resource is money. So how are we going to pay for this? Well, traditionally, we've been in a world where we've got 3 key life stages. We've got childhood, when we are educated. We've got adulthood, when we work and we raise families. And we've got old age, when we retire and we have a period of leisure. But as we go to an era in which we have fewer people in that second category to financially support those in those third categories, we're going to have to do something to address the issue. State pensions are not going to be sufficient. Private saving isn't sufficient. The increasing costs of healthcare, the increasing costs of care needs, which are particularly high in those late stages of life. I can think of a few different solutions. The first one, more young people. It may not solve the issue completely, but what can we do to encourage people to continue to have children? Can we reduce the cost of childcare? Can we make it an easier situation? The second one is politically often a challenging one, which is more migration. Not every country in the world is in the same position in terms of its demographic transition, so we can bring more people into the UK. The third one is tax the wealthy and improve our public pension provision while also helping people or encouraging people to save more. And the fourth one is to increase the retirement age. Now, none of those seem the easiest of solutions, but when the fifth is that of a Plan 75, they all seem like actually ones that we should be properly looking into. And in fact, what I want to question is whether those traditional 3 stages of life are what's right for society today. When we lived in an agricultural world and people were doing manual labor day to day, it was inevitable that you had to stop working at a certain stage of your life. When we moved to an industrial world and we were working in heavy machinery, again, such a progression was expected. But as we moved into a service economy and with more automation, with AI, with people being able to do some of those tasks, or with fewer people being able to do some of those tasks, and as we move more and more also into a caring economy, what should change? What does a 40-year long retirement look like if you have a longer life? Should we be reducing that? But what does that mean for the other stages of that life cycle? If you're working for 40, 50, 60 years as you're prolonging your retirement, what else do we need to look at? Well, firstly, if you told me at 21 coming out of Pembroke that I had 55 years, 60 years before I was able to retire, I would look at you with panic. We need to think about what that working life looks like. Do we need leisure time during that working life? Do we need breaks? But secondly, 50 years in the labour market is going to change hugely. So how do you reskill people as you're moving away from being able to do some tasks and more into being able to do other tasks at different stages of your life? One working life period between the age of 20 and 65 is not what our future looks like. And finally, what about that final stage? What about retirement? Well, the resource I've focused on so far has been money. And of course, many elderly people are working themselves part-time to support their pensions and top those up, but also working as volunteers and supporting a lot of civil society. But the resource I think a number of my colleagues on this panel are going to talk about more today is time and what it means to have quality, healthy time. And that is what medical advancements are offering us. Now, time, of course, is a huge resource. And it's also one that we have to manage, and we have to think about how we are using that. And I can't help reflect when I think about this as to one use of time that has changed significantly in the last 50 years, but that was undervalued financially for many, many generations in the past. And that is still undervalued today, because women's work, the role of cooking, the role of cleaning, the role of raising, the role of caring, or what has traditionally been seen as women's work in society, has so often not been financially valued by economists and by society as a whole. Now, we've seen a huge shift in that. Even if that's not falling into our GDP statistics, we have seen a nationwide and global shift in how we are valuing that use of time. I think that we can see that change in understanding of the value of the use of retirees' time in the future going forward as well. We can see their direct economic contributions in the workplace, in volunteering, in childcare, but we can also see their indirect contributions. Those do not have to be direct impacts on productivity. We can see the wisdom and the shared knowledge. And going back to Plan 75, we can also see the value of connectivity. Another great challenge of the 21st century, and one that I haven't mentioned, is the mental health crisis and a world of increased loneliness and social isolation. We have got a generation that has got more time on their hands than ever before. How can we use that time to connect? How can we use that time in that ever longer life cycle to build shared experiences and love? And how can we build a society and an economy that recognizes the true value of that? Thank you.
So our next speaker is Rav Seeruthun, and Rav is a William Pitt Fellow here at Pembroke, and he has worked with Roche and Genentech in San Francisco, and recently founded Health Equity AI in the area of health disparities.
Thank you very much. So our title today is Live and Let Die. How will society adapt when we all live longer? Initially, I'd like to start, like all of us are doing, starting with some data. In 2020, the number of people aged over 60 will outnumber those younger than 5 years across the whole world. And this is a global issue. Here we see in 1950, the median age was 22.2. It's skewed, right? So the floor of averages, look at the different colors here. But as we fast forward to 2021, the median age is 30. And again, you'll see the floor of averages in the distribution. By 2030, though, 1 in 6 people in the world will be aged over 60. Now, I'm going to focus today a lot on UK data, though, and then tell you some stories about healthcare. So if we look at these pyramids for the UK, well, on the left-hand side, it pretty much looks like a pyramid. It doesn't on the right. So think about this as we go through the talk, because by 2050 in the UK, it's projected that 1 in 4 people will be aged over 65. Now, the second question we were asked to consider was how should institutions and the associated social implications cope with this going forward? That's a really interesting question for me. Pam, as you said, I've just come from the West Coast, where I work for Genentech, and I think some people online are dialing in today for that. I'm a physician by training, and we were looking at this across the US. And the one thing that we learned very quickly with a field-based team was that you can't use a cookie-cutter approach to healthcare across the United States. And it's a very similar issue here. And here's why. If you just look at the density here, which represents the proportion of people aged over 65, from 2016 to 2039, you can't apply a same model for services and healthcare as you would do in London or Cornwall or Scotland. And the example I wanted to give is quite close to my heart for various reasons, which is diabetes. So now I'm going to tell you a story with some data related to diabetes. It's a complex issue because one of the areas that we have to think about are these things are not in isolation. Despite having one of the highest GDPs, the UK continues to grapple with stark health inequalities. Life expectancy in the poorest parts of the UK can be 10 years lower compared to wealthy areas. Now, that's best illustrated with the example I'm going to show next. So I'm going to talk to you now a bit about diabetes. So diabetes is a good example because if you look here on the left-hand side and you look at prevalence versus age, you can see the category of people over 75 and 65 to 74. It's also a good example because everyone here will know somebody affected by this. But the UK, unfortunately, hit a major milestone. In 2023, we now have 5 million people in this country living with diabetes. There's different types of diabetes, type 1 and type 2 diabetes, type 1 tending to be insulin dependent, type 2 dependent on medication tablets and also diet. But the outcomes are very, very severe, and we'll have to live with these as we go forward. So patients with diabetes have a 2 to 3 times increased risk of heart rates and of strokes. And the complications are catastrophic. You can get blindness, which is preventable, kidney disease, and limb amputations. Now, technology, we've heard a lot about that from the panel. We will hear a lot about it. So there's some great technologies out there. A lot of you will have seen this. You probably have seen continuous glucose monitoring, which then allows you to connect to an app, a phone. And then if you see in this picture here, the person also has a pump on them. That's an insulin pump. It's linked, so you get a closed loop here. Great technology, really interesting data. One of the partnerships we have at the moment is with Roche Diabetes Care, and this is their data. So if you look at adoption of this, when they asked and surveyed a number of people, 72% of those aged over 65 would consider this technology to be very or extremely beneficial. You can guess probably what the next slide is going to show. There is an unintended consequence of this, which is digital exclusion. Because when we look at the actual figures, only 39% in that population have access and are using continuous glucose monitoring. And then the pump that's linked to it, only 41%. Now, why is that? And I founded a company with Professor Ian Colwell, he's in the audience, called healthequity.ai, where we try and partner on these solutions. One of them is actually relatively straightforward. When you look at access to the internet, you have to upload this data. It's actually quite challenging. Look at the population here that are 75 and above who don't have access to the internet. And also you can look at that for the 65 to 74-year-olds. Now, this slide also gives us this is work that's been generated that also looks at social deprivation. Now, it's a crude rating, but those are the letters you see. Now, DE, it's politically probably incorrect, stands for semi-skilled and unskilled manual occupations, unemployment and low-grade occupations. But 14% of that group also don't have access to the internet. So add all of these up and you have some major challenges. But we're talking today about age, but think about what it means, and Pam, you said this, about getting older and having chronic conditions. So one thing with diabetes that we've been looking at is the link between that and deprivation. So here, if you have diabetes, and it's type 2 diabetes we're talking about here, and you are living in one of the most deprived areas, unfortunately, on a measure of diabetes control, blood sugar, HbA1c, and other measures like cholesterol, the most deprived don't do well. And then if you look at these 8 areas, and we have sort of 8 processes we look at, the most deprived are worse off. So we're creating problem after problem. And my theme here is it's complex, because then let's look at another level. Let's add in ethnicity. So if you look at different populations, people from an Asian background, people from a Bangladeshi background, or people from a Black Afro-Caribbean background, they are more likely, they're more prevalent to have this. I spend a lot of my time now, I previously worked at Roche in a medical role in Genentech, looking at things like this. I'm sitting there looking at a map going, how am I going to do anything about this? What can I do to make this actionable? Where's the signal from the noise? And it's very, very difficult. And 2 things I would like to say about our journey. One is, seriously look for the signal. The signal is very, very hard to find. Look for the signal within the noise. And technology can help us on that journey. Technology can take things away, but can build for us. And the second is my favorite TV show, The Detectorist, BBC 2, went to BBC 1. Please do watch it. My colleagues watching it. A lot of this is detective work. And I'm going to show you some detective work we've been on the journey for the last couple of months. So let's look at just various different factors added together. So imagine we could use data for good, AI for good, and we could look at areas of the UK, CCGs, they're a subset of areas in the UK for healthcare. And then we could look at those aged between 65 and 79, and then we look at deprivation, and then we look at how people get their care applied and the processes applied. And if we do that, and this is the piece of work that we've been working on at the moment, you're going to see a lot of data, but I'm going to highlight one particular area. You get interesting links, but where's the signal? These are all good signals. You'll recognize, unfortunately, some of the names on the left that have challenging healthcare problems. But let's just look at Liverpool for a second. So 47.8% of people live 65 to 79 in this subset area of the CCG. There is 95.7 deprivation ranking. Obviously, 100's high, 0 is low. But only 37% of people are receiving all their care processes. I mean, this is catastrophic, but rarely talked about in the UK. It is talked about a lot in the US. So 57 years ago, Martin Luther King said, of all the forms of inequality and injustice in healthcare, healthcare is the most shocking and inhumane. What we're trying to do and partner is to look at AI-driven insights, look at machine learning, and then look at actionability. Who can help solve this problem? And ultimately, partner to offer the solutions to this. I'm going to close, though, on something, Pam, that you mentioned. I come from the West Coast. I've been in San Francisco for the last 3 years and have just come back. The big news over there is longevity. How can we make people live longer? This is Jeff Bezos, obviously. He has Altos Labs. For those that want to go and visit them, they're on Granta Park next to the bicycle. So you can go and have a look there. And obviously, and there's some Genentech alumni who formed Calico, another company looking at this in great detail. So I started this and with the title Live and Let Die, but I'm going to finish on another song and another song title, because my theory is if we don't address these issues, who wants to live forever? Thank you.
Thank you. Great. Our next speaker is Dr. Pauline Essah. Obviously, the full bios of all our speakers are in the program, just doing a short summary. Pauline's also an alumna of this college, and she's passionate about improving people's lives and transforming society. She's Director of Research and Programs at Education Sub-Saharan Africa, also Essah. I just asked if it was a coincidence, where she provides strategic leadership in improving the quality of education in the region. So welcome, Pauline.
Good evening, all. It's a pleasure to be here. Thanks for the invitation. So I'm going to take you on a bit of a journey around the world, not in 180 days, but as quickly as I can. You've heard from Rav about what's happening in the UK, and I'll take you on, take you through some of these graphs. I mean, for me, I want to look at 2 areas in trying to understand the impact of us living longer and how that can affect economic and other areas of life. So I'll be looking at some of the demographics. Rav started off in the world and moved to narrow down into the UK. I will be doing more of that geographic focus, but also I want to touch on the sustainable development goals, and I'll go into that in a bit more detail. So starting off, I've just put some graphs up here, and that's the picture of the world. Again, highlighting some of what Rav said. And you can see really, I want you to focus on the bulge, current year, 2023, and the projections for 2050. And as you can see, the bulge, I mean, for the world, there will be an increase in the population, or that's the prediction. But actually, the population pyramid is showing the bulge going more narrowly, but increasing in terms of how long people are living generally. But interestingly, if you start looking at a continental level, or even down to country-specific level, and if you're interested in that kind of stuff, these diagrams can be found on Population Pyramid, as well as the UN Statistics website. But as you can see, when you come to Europe, actually the bulge begins to expand in the middle years, between the ages of 25 right through to about 75 in 2023. And you can see the change happening as we progress to 2050. As Rav pointed out, it is quite worrying that the numbers go higher and higher, and we can see from that there will be a smaller youthful population, which can have impact on what happens in the future years. Looking at Asia, that's what the graph looks like now, but also in the future. Again, the middle ages from 40 onwards through to 80 are showing a bigger bulge as we progress in life. Latin America and the Caribbean, you see again, in the middle years, the bulge is growing bigger as we move towards 2050. And let me show you what it looks like in Northern America. Again, similar trends. The middle ages are where the bulge is going. Oceania, a larger bulge from down towards the top. When you look at Africa, a very different picture. There is a strong youth bulge at the moment, and actually very few people growing to the age when you compare with other parts of the world. I'm showing you these graphs just to highlight that aging seems to be different across the different geographic areas. And life expectancy and the quality of life in these different areas need to be looked at in terms of how do we prepare for the future, where people are aging, or the concentration of life is happening at different levels depending on where you're based geographically. A publication in the Financial Times just last week confirms what was in the pyramids. As you can see, the level of the population size stays about even across the years in the coming to 2100. But for Sub-Saharan Africa, you see the onwards trend. And for this, I'm just highlighting, I mean, the different takeaways you can have from these graphs. But what I wanted to actually point out, and again, we can discuss as we go into the session, is the fact that these differences need us to think about how we address the growing, the coming years in terms of economic productivity, in terms of social structures. How can we make sure that depending on where you are in the world, you have the infrastructure, you have the care, you have the ability to live a long and fulfilling life, no matter where you are and no matter who you are. So I'm thinking, bringing us from the local and the national, looking at more international, and how we can make sure that there's equality of life no matter where you are based. The second take home I want is the focus on the youth bulge and the fact that although we are talking about the elderly and the quality of life as you grow, there is a lot that needs to be done at the youth level, especially in areas of the world where there's a greater bulge, and that will happen over time. My next bit was about the Sustainable Development Goals. I mean, there's 17 of them, and they were set up or they were agreed by nations across the world in 2015. Many of you will know them. There are 211 different indicators that the UN is monitoring, and there's a lot of quality data being collected about these development goals. And I am very interested in these goals because they are a blueprint for us across the world to find a way to live that fulfilling and impactful life, no matter where you are, no matter what age you are at. But they are not easy to address. And actually, there was some progress between 2016, with a target year being 2030, where a lot of these are addressed. But obviously, COVID has put a bit of a spanner in the works, and some SDGs have halted, others have regressed a bit. So there is more work to be done to be able to get us back on track. But this, if we can address these goals and to the level where we can see progress, that will be one way of addressing the quality of life, no matter your age, and especially for the elderly. So just quickly as well to show, SDG 3 is the one that really focuses on good health and well-being. And so that is the one that is tracking different elements for the quality of life and well-being. But actually, the interesting thing about the SDGs is that they're all interconnected. And so, for example, you find that they're focused on no poverty. It is an important one. If everybody has access to food and nutrition, again, which connects to SDG 2, you will find that the quality of life, the ability for people to have nutrition and be able to battle or avoid having mental health issues and increases. All of that helps with the quality of life. But also, if we look at SDG 10, for example, reducing inequality, I mean, if we are able to address that kind of issue, it helps people to live more confident lives, be more productive in society. Nobody wants to live in an unequal world where they are not taken seriously. Also, so again, it's showing that interconnection between these different SDGs, which are vital for really improved lives across the globe, including for older people. I've also mentioned quality education. Again, that's a particular interest of mine. As Nelson Mandela said, the best way to improve people's lives is through education. And again, I feel that the more education there is about some of these demographic changes coming up and also the importance of these SDGs, it would better prepare us as a society. Now we live in a global world as a society to be able to tackle some of these very difficult and very interconnected challenges. Another one that is of interest is gender equality. Knowing what is coming, how can we make sure that our elderly or people of all ages are treated with are given the information or the skills that they need that may vary across genders to make sure that they can contribute effectively to society. Again, cities, human settlements, what are we doing based on the data and the evidence we have to make sure that if we have elderly people, that they have the right environment to be able to navigate irrespective of whatever challenges they may face. And I think by thinking about these different issues, clean water, climate change, again, a big one. There's a lot of migration happening because of earthquakes and war and famine. How do we make sure that across the world, there is provision for ensuring that people of all ages can be able to live effective lives and contribute to society? The last one I put on there is the partnership for the goals. How are we making sure that our different governments, that our countries are connecting on improving the speed at which we can address these global goals as a way of making sure that we can all live long and fulfilling lives? Because from where I sit, it's important that collectively and cooperating across these different countries, that we ensure that there is inclusion, that there's health and economic security across the different countries and the globe, if we are to be able to live long and meaningful lives without being a burden on others. So for me, I mean, there's so many different ways we can kill this cat, but I think based on the demographic data, based on the goals that the Sustainable Development Network is trying to achieve, maybe one of the things we need to do is make sure we continue to invest in gathering high quality data and evidence that can be used for effective decision-making, whether at the community level, at the country level, or internationally. But also to make sure that we are using that data and evidence for effective planning for these projections. What are we investing in? Is it, are the pensions, as Julia was saying, are they fit for purpose? Are there other ways in which we can make sure that, for example, carers and caregivers who are currently, in many cases, not even paid for their services or underpaid, are given the support they need to make sure that they can look after the young, but also the old, and also the infrastructure, as I said, and youth employment. That could be one of the ways in which we can make sure that things are happening. But also the fact that there's a youth bulge in other parts of the world, could that be the solution? If we invest effectively in the different parts of the world, can that be? We know that robots will be here and they will do their bit, but you need the people to also support people of all ages. And again, I think you and I, we all have a role to play in making sure that the elderly and the young are able to live this sustainable life. And I've put here, based on the data and evidence, can we just try and do our best to prepare for what's to come, because there are projections and we've seen them and we know there's more that we can do before the time comes. So for me, again, I'm looking at this internationally and globally because I really do think that all lives matter, and it's not our place to choose who lives where and when for how long, and that there is stuff we can do now to prevent that. And I'd like to finish off really by just quoting someone that I really admire, Nelson Mandela. And as he said, you can read for yourselves. If we can make sure that our old, again, old may be a relative term. My kids think I'm a dinosaur, so anything is possible. But I really believe there's more we can do to support our elderly. And I hope you agree with me. Thank you.
Our last speaker is Professor Stephen John. And Stephen's a fellow of Pembroke and professor of the philosophy of public health in the Department of History and Philosophy of Science here at Cambridge. He has researched and published on a range of topics at the intersection of political philosophy, philosophy of science, and public policy. And interestingly, he's looking at a couple of COVID-related things at the moment, which you can read about in his bio. So, Stephen, thank you. Over to you.
So in 2002, the great sociologist, W.G. Runciman, was interviewed about his views on the future of political and social science. And he told us an odd story. Runciman says when he was a young scholar in the 1950s, he couldn't understand all the fuss about feminism. Because in his view, it's very important that men and women should be treated equally. You know, he was author of SDG 5, yeah? But he thought that men were just like women. Oh, yeah. Yeah.
It's can hear.
Can you hear me? Do you need to hear me? No. So Runciman couldn't understand the fuss because he thought men and women should be treated equally. But women were just like men, give them a few more opportunities, and it would all get sorted out. And then Runciman said, as he went on and learned from his colleagues, he realized, but of course, the key issues here aren't just about material inequalities, but instead, as a result of these complex biological differences, social structures, the experience of marginalization, and so on, women had a different set of experiences, which gave them a different perspective on these issues. So creating a just and effective social policy didn't involve treating women as if they were just, you know, men, but lacking something. Instead, it involved taking seriously their different perspective, their different voice, maybe taking seriously notions of different ways of spending time, different notions of value and productivity. So why am I telling you? Well, Runciman goes on to say something really interesting. He said, as he was getting older himself, he was beginning to wonder if being old wasn't the same. But we often think of the elderly as if they are just the young, but with slightly dodgier hips. But, you know, instead, there's a sense in which the old have, as a result of biology, as a result of social structures, as a result of marginalized experiences, and so on, a different perspective. And just as we won't solve social problems around equity and equality, let's say between men and women, but just by some fiddling around the edges, instead we need to listen to the voices of women, so too, we need to take account of the distinctive experience of the elderly. I was really fascinated when I read this quote, and it's kind of been annoying for 20 years. Okay? I want to take it seriously in this talk. One thing which happens when you take it seriously, you should be deeply suspicious of this panel. Yeah? This is like a panel on gender equity with only men. This is a panel on Black Lives Matter with only white people. Yeah? We're all relatively young. Don't trust us. Yeah? But beyond that, there's something else going on here. There's a good news, bad news story. So here's one thing we know. Already in the UK, huge amounts of healthcare spending go on the elderly. And as we have more and more people living for longer, that will only get worse. Even if we have very cheap treatments being developed, lots of people needing a cheap treatment is a lot of money overall. Yeah? That's a lesson from Jeffrey Rhodes. So, and beyond that, of course, I mean, given how, let's say, carcinogenesis works as the accumulation of random mutations, the longer people live, the more time there is for the random mutations to occur. We're all going to get cancer the longer we live. Healthcare spending is going to go through the roof. Now, healthcare spending is already an issue. So, in fact, some people have suggested there should be what's called a fair innings. So after about 75, 80, people disagree on the number, boom, you lose your entitlement to healthcare. That seems arbitrary and unjust. But there's a problem here. How does Runciman's argument help us? Well, maybe it helps us by realizing that when we're thinking about the allocation of resources, we should take seriously the notion that the elderly experience life in a different way. And because they have a different set of experiences, maybe different models for providing healthcare are important. We should take seriously the notion that there's a contextual element to how we live our lives, to what constitutes good health. So that's a good sign. By recognizing difference, we help solve a social problem. I now want to suggest, however, that Runciman's insights or Runciman's proposals have a dark side. To do that, I want to do something people don't enjoy doing. I want to go back to 2020 and the experience of lockdown. Okay? In some sense, under lockdown, everyone suffered the same burden. Yeah? Everyone had to stay at home, couldn't socialize, and so on. But there's a key difference in this case between, let's say, an 18-year-old and an 80-year-old. Both the 18 and the 80-year-old lose out massively. But for the 80-year-old, the costs of lockdown come with a benefit. Yeah? If he or she got COVID, they'd be in serious trouble. The average 18-year-old, they got COVID, it wouldn't really have made much difference. So what's going on in the case of lockdown is, in effect, we are locking down the entire population for the benefit of a small subset, the older people in society. It's a massively unequal distribution of costs and benefits across generations. That's not to say the policy wasn't justified. Yeah? Sometimes massive redistributions of resources are justified. Otherwise, taxation wouldn't be allowed. What it is, however, is to raise a question. Assuming the policies are justified, how do you get people to agree to this kind of policy? Well, here's one thing. You could give them like a really complex philosophical argument I favor. Strangely enough, those don't actually motivate people to act, okay? Here's a second thing you could do. You could just use the law, lock everyone up. That works, but only at the edges, yeah? I mean, if every 18-year-old had gone out to the park at the same time, nothing the police could do. So what do we do? What did we do? We appeal to solidarity. We tell people, you're all in this together. The teenagers in the bedroom, they're like a worker who goes on strike, where the worker herself doesn't expect to gain herself from the strike, but because she recognizes a similarity, she recognizes solidarity, she takes a hit for the sake of the collective. And that notion of solidarity, many people think, ultimately lies at the bottom of our healthcare funding model more generally. In some sense, we all pay into the NHS, but not because we expect to benefit ourselves necessarily. In some ways, we don't want to benefit. We don't want to have to go to hospital. But instead, we pay in partly because of the sense we're all in this together. But note, that sense of solidarity, that solidaristic urge, requires a recognition of some kind of similarity. Yeah? This is exactly what far-right populist parties know. You just make migrants the other. They're outside the realm of solidarity because they are different. And already, that sense of similarity, of shared experience is under attack. Already, we find young people telling us that the elderly don't really think they're in it all together, but the elderly are happy to take pensions and yet not contribute back. Is this sense justifiable? This breakdown of solidarity? Complicated, yeah? Very complicated. But go back to Runciman's insight. But in some sense, the elderly's experience is fundamentally different from those of the young. I told you it looked like that solved the social problem. It doesn't. It makes it a lot worse. Because if Runciman is right, the social basis of solidarity is missing. There is some deep dissimilarity which threatens the basis of the system we have. And that's a giant problem, because what I told you earlier was we often think that an aging population gives us a problem, how to split up the pie in new ways, novel ways. What I am suggesting is that an aging population challenges the very kind of willingness to contribute to the pie in the first place, the sense of social solidarity there. You might think this concern is overstated, yeah? Because there's one more reason you might take part in these big social ventures, and that's something along the lines of enlightened self-interest, yeah? Maybe the real reason you pay into the NHS isn't because you think we're all in this together, it's because it's a kind of insurance scheme. Yeah, you pay in now to get back in future. That might be right, but note what self-interest requires in this context. Self-interest requires stability. It requires some guarantee that what people are getting now is what the young themselves will also get in the future. Otherwise, we're paying into an insurance scheme with no guarantee of a payout in the future. And that sense of stability, I take it, is something which itself is under attack. So is it good for people to live longer? It's good for people living longer, yeah? And it's good, I think, to recognize as well, though, that living longer isn't just about more of the same. It's important to take Runciman's insight seriously, but there might be a fundamental difference or some sense of fundamental different set of experiences which we need to take seriously in social policy. I think we should also see that stressing difference is a double-edged sword, because what it does is it undermines solidarity and hence undermines our healthcare system. That's all. Thank you.
So we've got a discussion among the panel now, and I'm going to go here. But we have a couple of people, in fact, 4 that might want to say something. You don't all have to. Samantha, Anushka, Joshua, and Geeta. I don't know who you are, but if you wanted to say something, stick your hand up. Yes. Have we got a mic, Kate? No, you'll need the mic, I think. Yeah.
Thank
Can
you.
you say who you are as well?
Yes. Can you hear me? Okay. Thank you very much. Yes, I'm Samantha Deacon, alum of Pembroke and current program manager of the Impulse program, entrepreneurship program at the Maxwell Center on the West Cambridge site. Thank you very much to the panel. Some really interesting comments. I wanted to pick up on something that Dr. Essah was talking about, the interconnectedness of all of the SDGs, and then also that Dr. Bird mentioned the different options for, okay, how are we going to fix this? And some of these seem to be really quite problematic. And maybe it's because I'm American, and maybe it's because I've just read Factfulness, which takes a really, positive look on certain things. But I'd like to just pose to the panel as to whether the option of raising the retirement age, which sounds like a really top-down approach, maybe we can refer to it as the option of, as a society, thinking that it's really great if people work for longer. And how that is interconnected with the mental health challenges that we have, where people might just start feeling, there's real value that you get from working, whether it's on a voluntary basis or otherwise, and then how that is interconnected with the falling birth rate. So my mother, thank God, since I have a 2.5-year-old, has just moved from the US to here. And that means that I can come along to events like this. That means that I can work more, etc. So can we view it in a really positive light, this kind of opportunity that we have with this aging population to be more economically active for longer? And how is that interconnected with the kind of other ways of solving some of these challenges? Thank you.
Yeah. Julie, do you want to take that first? And then anyone else who wants to chip in, but Julie.
Sure. Thank you. That's a very good question. I'm not sure I've got the answer. There is one philosopher, and I look at the philosopher on the panel but I can't come up with the name of who raised this, that said that over the course of this century, we will lose the word retirement, that the concept of retiring is no longer going to be feasible going forward. This idea that we save, or that the public saves, so that beyond a certain stage of life, beyond 65, 70, the public's going to start paying us a certain amount that's enough to cover our living standards, is no longer feasible. Now, of course, the public might still pay something. There might be a minimum income, there might be some level, but I do think we are going to move into a world, and we already are in it, where many people will have some level of work on a voluntary basis in civil society, work in terms of childcare, different ways in which they're interacting with society, either earning a living from that or some part of a living from that, or indeed giving to society in other ways. I think that is fundamentally valuable. I don't think we're recognizing it in this country at the moment. I don't know about models so much elsewhere. I do think there's a couple of interesting experiments, which I'm sure many people have heard about. So there is the situation now. I think in the UK, it's happening in a few small places. In Sweden, it's happened more, where you have links between nurseries and preschool education, primary school education, and old people's homes. One trend we are going to see in the UK in coming years is we're going to need fewer primary schools because we've got fewer young people coming through. What's going to happen in those spaces? Are we going to be closing primary schools in rural villages? Or are we going to need to think about some new ways of using those spaces and some new ways of educating the very young? And are there links that we can create from this longer, healthy time that's coming at the end of our lives? So really interesting questions. Another one, I know students in Pembroke are lucky enough, or they were in my day, and I think they still are now, to live in college rooms. But in other university towns, there was a lot of talk in the press about a month ago, going back to Manchester, say, as a student, and not being able to afford the private rents because of the price of rent crisis that we have at the moment. Another system that is in place in some areas, although it's very small scale, is the elderly letting out a room in their home. Now that builds connections, that may reduce loneliness. It's a route. None of them are one size fits all. It's not a solution to everything, but I think we do have to be innovative at thinking what are the different ways that we engage with society at different stages of our life.
Pauline, do you want to say something as well about the SDGs?
Yes, thank you very much for the question. I think that it is a good thing to look at options for the elderly who are in retirement, who may want to work. I think it's not something that society should be imposing on them, because they would have done their time as well before they got to that age. But also the global person in me is thinking about all the youth out there who are unemployed. I work in the part of the world where, say, 12 million young people are graduating from university each year, and 3 million are finding jobs. There are lots of people out there who need jobs. They need opportunities to contribute to socioeconomic development, and they cannot find it. So by all means, if elderly people want to work, again, to maintain their mental health or to fight that they are involved in something, giving back in some way, absolutely fine. But I think there are alternatives. Already we're short of workforce. We are importing health carers and teachers from outside the UK. And that is not sustainable, because wherever you're getting them from, they are also being depleted. So my thing is about us investing, looking beyond our shores, investing in the development in the other parts of the world where there's a surplus, but they may not yet have the skills and experience they need. If we invest, it's a global village now. If we look beyond our shores and invest outside of the UK, it will benefit the UK and the rest of the world. That's my approach.
Okay. Can I ask a question? I think it's Stephen and Julia. So Stephen, you mentioned the collapse of solidarity or potential collapse. And what are the financial consequences of that collapse? And I think I'm quoting the right person. Uwe Reinhardt was a wonderful health economist at Princeton, and he had a chart, the late Uwe Reinhardt, about decision makers and resource allocation. And they were very old decision makers who were allocating resources towards the end of life and not neonatal care. And it was sort of classic. I mean, it's a bit of a parody, but how do we get that resource allocation right in the context of these extraordinary changes?
I wish I knew. I mean, so on the resource allocation issue, it's useful to remember that the UK is very strange in having such a complex technical system for resource allocation. So via NICE, via a notion of quality maximization, the notion that in fact we spend money on healthcare in a way which maximizes the number of quality adjusted life years. We do have, in some ways, a system which is meant to avoid any kind of discrimination. So it's meant to avoid discrimination towards the young or the elderly, or towards those with disabilities or those without disabilities, and so on. It's just that in practice, what we find is that even if you have this kind of broadly mechanical system, this kind of which doesn't feature the individual's biases comprehend, he still ends up with huge amounts of spending towards the end of life. One reason that's true is precisely because the way you do healthcare spending in the UK is we don't take account of something like economic productivity. The quality measures the quality of your life to you, and very definitely not to other people. But changing that would be controversial and difficult in lots of ways.
Gordon Brown spotted it when he was Chancellor about the economic productivity of the ill versus the healthy. I think.
Yeah, but that's very definitely not what we do
Yeah.
in the current NHS system. Very definitely.
Do you have any comments on economic resource allocation?
I think, so not on that direct answer that you've given, but the resource allocation over our lifespan, I think one big challenge we have at the moment, and I'm sure many of the students in the room feel this heavily, is many of the decisions we're making to address these challenges today are actually going to affect the younger generation adversely in the future. So it is a case of what does my future look like as well, and thinking about those at the early stage of their working life today, coming out of university with student loans, looking at a housing market where they can't afford rents, where they don't know how to get a deposit on a house, and being asked to add 10 years to their working life to pay in.
Well, the triple lock is still on.
Well, the triple lock exactly is still on. And then some of them, when they're lucky, because of existing inequalities, when they are in their late 30s or 40s, and they will receive a small share, will receive a very sizable inheritance because their parents' houses are worth an absolute fortune. And so we are creating these persistent inequalities that are only going to grow generation to generation. So I do think we have to look, when we're thinking about the resource allocation, as what we are offering to those who are going to have to pay. And that, to my mind, comes back to those 3 stages of life and that traditional 3 stages of life idea I raised, which is that if you're telling a 20-year-old that they're going to work until they're 70, you actually do need to say, hang on a sec, what does that work look like? Are there breaks embedded in that? Do you have opportunities to reskill? Do you have opportunities to really have a quality of life in that time? And so it's not just more and more costs to deal with this.
Yes, Rav.
One of the things we've been looking at is where people live. There's a lot of work out there in cancer treatment and oncology that the older population in certain can tend to live in more coastal areas. The trouble is the services aren't. So as much as you want to engage with the service, there is no service there. And actually, you can clearly see that there are some worse cancer outcomes depending on where you live. So you need the infrastructure to be built and think about what that future infrastructure is going to look like, which is very, very difficult because I agree that obviously we have, and the master was involved in this, we have a number of gatekeepers, whether it's nice as we look through this, but the infrastructure just often isn't set up, and therefore there's a bias in the system for those that can access it. I'll give you another example. It's a difficult example, but if you are diagnosed with cancer, you go to a multidisciplinary team meeting. There's lots of people sitting around and your case is discussed. The patient often is there, but if the patient is slower in conversation, some of those meetings take 8 minutes now. If you're younger with cancer and you're there and you're very clued up and you have your sheet, it's great. But if you're not, you don't get 10 minutes, you don't get 15 minutes, you get 8 minutes because the system is set in such that it has to all be done within a certain time period. So the structural challenges we have for this to be fair going forward.
And Rav, I was going to ask you, with your digital exclusion numbers for diabetes or indeed other tech, what policy would you bring in about digital exclusion of, in your case, the elderly, with your example?
Can I ask somebody in the audience?
Yes.
My colleague is here, Ian. Can you you take the mic, because this is something that, so Ian, if you want to introduce
Can
yourself.
somebody get Ian a mic?
If there's a mic, then somebody. and then Kate's coming around, because this is a topic that you brought me to because you deal with this in your lab, and how to address it though, Ian, is not something that I've got an answer to. But
Hi. So you want me to define a policy?
well, what can we do to address it? So what are the things
Well,
that
I
we
think
could
the
What
first
do
thing-
you do, Ian? What's your,
just introduce yourself as well?
Yeah.
Thanks.
The first thing you do, I think, is listen, because it's a very complex problem. So just going ahead and defining policy is a very difficult thing to do. I think if you look across society, digital exclusion is happening ubiquitously, pervasively, almost everywhere. You can't park your car now without an app to pay for your parking, you know. So
if I challenge both of you, some people at the top of the NHS go, look what happened. And I might ask Mohammed to comment, when the COVID vaccine was accessible through the NHS app and usage went through the roof and people's kids were helping them because there was an absolute transactional motivation to do that. So why can't we have that sort of thing? Why can't we have that for
And I think
diabetes?
What we've been looking at in this area is, if you have that societal engagement around it, it works. But when it doesn't work, you are completely excluded. I'll give you an example. I was a GP in Kent in Medway. This is a tough area in the UK. I would go to houses that didn't have phones. I mean, let alone didn't have access to the internet. And that's still the case to this day. So I think the challenge is, the first challenge, Ian, I think you're right, is awareness. Let's be aware of it, and then let's try and address it going forward. I think the second thing though is, again, I like showing examples. For that continuous glucose monitor, for 48 hours, somebody updated the app was updated. What happened? No one could check their blood glucose over the weekend for the whole weekend, and so the number of phone calls that came in. So it's the unintended consequences. Those that knew what to do called people, and it all worked out. But that weekend, and it was a very difficult weekend in the NHS, there was a failure in the system where bias was introduced because those that had access to other devices could do it. So I think the answer to your question, Pam, is it's addressing and knowing the issue is happening, understanding that there are those that won't have access to it, and then hopefully societal institutions partnering to solve those problems. I think that would be a
Because on the planning call for this event, I described my son saying I was an asset grabber, which is the long line, and somebody else said, okay, boomer. And I was very struck with your description, Pauline, of what's happening in Africa and migration. You touched on migration, but and our inequity here, or a sort of dysfunctional labor market that needs young people. But do you have any comments on what you think should happen with the differential in demographic sort of profiles of all of our countries?
I have no doubt that the workforce for the future is in the global south. There's no doubt about that. And that is why I keep coming to the fact that it is in everybody's interest to see how best we can support, be it through the SDGs, support in different ways to make sure that the world is more equitable. Because it is these young people who will be taking care of the world everywhere in the world. And they are frustrated, they are very intelligent, but they don't have the opportunities that you see elsewhere. And until some of those issues are solved, you will continue to see people jump onto boats to try and get to the West just for a better life economically or whatever. And I think as well that already we see that happening in this part of the world, where many of the carers, many of the workforce are actually migrants. But if we want to have a fairer world, we would be investing in those areas as well. There are a lot of people who can do the work internally as well as externally. But at the moment, we are taking the cream of the crop, bringing them here, and then the others are suffering.
Yeah. Stephen, do you have any comments on that?
I mean, I think what Pauline said sounds exactly right. There's a giant issue of global justice. And yeah.
I mean, there's the thing hovering in the background of can only rich people afford the cost of aging well? Rav, you touched on it a few times because, you know, that all the new cancer drugs, extraordinarily expensive. And they're not old for older people. And it's going to be more and more stark, I would have thought, that dilemma for us of paying for treatments and therapies unless we have Plan 75 over here, which is unlikely.
And it's something that globally is different. And obviously, if you take the sort of macro global opinions, obviously, if you look at insurance-based schemes of healthcare, came from the US recently, that's a really tricky area because the insurance schemes will decide what they'll pay for, and unfortunately, that's why you see people working to a very elderly age in the US to keep their cover, and so that skews things. But there are certain the way they work things out. There are certain drugs that are just not covered because they are too expensive. That just happened with Alzheimer's. There was a big bust in the US recently with a drug that came through by a company I won't name, but they priced so high, they were not going to get it through Medicare, Medicaid, and they were also not getting through the insurance schemes. So there needs to be some responsibility on all parties when they do these developments and research and development. Now, in a nationalized system, that is even somewhat more challenging because there's a finite pot of funding, and therefore you need gatekeepers in those systems. But when it comes to longevity, the work that's happening with Calico and the work that's happening at Altos, I really worry that that's going to be exclusively available to those that have money. It's about longevity. So it's likely to not be a medicine that will be prescribed to you acutely. It's likely to be something that's going to be ongoing or something that you're going to need to engage with over a period of time. I don't think that our healthcare system isn't set up that way. And I really worry that it will be accessible to the very few, and that will make these inequalities even wider. And it's a real challenge. Now, what they're looking at the moment are actually, because they're aware of this, there are good people at those companies, and a number of our colleagues may work at them. But what they're looking at are things that we heard earlier. How do you prevent cancer? Because that's ultimately a virtuous goal, really. How do you prevent dementia versus looking at treatment intervention? That's going to have, of course, a byproduct. Everyone will live longer, because and that will then be a really interesting challenge, because I don't know their research, and there is limited research that's been published, but that is going to leave us with a challenge, because I don't think we're looking at this 50 years away. Probably think we're looking at this sort of 10 to 20 years away, and then the pressures will come even more onto the system.
Any other comment? Yeah, Pauline.
I just wanted to add as well that in terms of, say, treatment, a lot of the drugs you have out there that work for this part of the world don't necessarily work elsewhere as effectively, because often the clinical trials, the testing, whatever, doesn't happen with those populations in mind.
And they're also done on men. Just say that as a feminist.
So I know, working in global health space, that there are lots of these drugs that actually are not effective when taken by people in the global south, because they weren't considered when the drugs were being manufactured. And again, many of them cannot even afford these. There are good companies out there who produce some of these drugs at a discounted rate, or sometimes even giving them out for free. But again, I think that needs to come to the fore in terms of, if we are going to treat everybody equally and try and prevent some of these diseases and whatever that are taking a toll on our economic considerations here, there needs to be a more global thought coming into this. And many of the SDGs I mentioned, nutrition, the education, whatever, they're all levers that we can tap into now, while we still have the youthful population, to make sure that the young will grow. When they do grow, that they are equipped with the skills and the knowledge that they need to be better prepared for a longer life, if they are blessed to have that.
So, Stephen, is it good for people to live longer? You're a philosopher.
I was just wondering. Exactly. No, I was wondering because, Rav was talking about extending longevity, and you mentioned earlier that, in the UK, the average male now can live to 80, the average woman to 83. Of course, one thing we know is that in every developed country, there's a gap between male life expectancy and female life expectancy. So women live longer than men. But we also know, at least in the UK, women tend to be much unhealthier than men. So we know that they kind of live longer, but die unhealthier. And I think there's a genuine question then. If the inequality disappears, when you take account not just the quantity of life, but quality of life. And so partly in that case, that's just about quality in a narrowly negative sense, but also, I guess, in a broader sense. There's philosophers love this case. If you lived forever, would you just get bored? So, there's a sense in which the notion of dying gives meaning to a life. Because if you knew there was no death, what's the point, really? There's a sense in which a narrative of a life depends on dying at some point. And yet, weirdly, push it forward a little bit. But if that constitutes an improvement in quality, overall quality.
Yeah, it's interesting.
Very tricky.
Do you have any thoughts on that? I haven't seen this film yet, Japanese film, but a dystopia.
No, I've told you a little bit about that film, and actually, from an economic side in that film, the Plan 75 works so well because there are so many private businesses that set up that think, oh, well, the 10 years before you turn 75, you're going to want to spend your money enjoying some nice holidays and having all of these leisure things. And they think it's stimulated the economy so much that, and I don't want to give away too much of the film because you might go off and watch it. But at some point, the idea of Plan 65 is then raised. And so there, when you start having the inverse process where actually society is telling you, no, you should live fewer years, but enjoy them more. Do we want to live longer? I think individually we all do, if we have a good quality of life, if we have those connections. But in Plan 75, what was notable was that the people who were selecting into doing this were those who were feeling isolated for various reasons, be that their children or their grandchildren were disconnected from them geographically, or be that they were less able to do their job or what they had done to sustain their living in the past nowadays, or be that they were losing friends and losing pastimes and pleasurable activities. So if we are to live longer, we have to make sure that that's quality time. Whether or not we want it, it's an open question. If my life was good, I would want it, but that's a big, big if.
Who in the audience would like to live to 120? Yeah, go on. Yeah, go on. Go. Go, stick your hands up. Yeah? Yeah, go on, stick them up. It's probably a mate. But then I suppose there's a qualifying question of if it's a high quality of life. Yeah, interesting. Any other comments on this?
For me, I think I would love to live longer if I felt I was still contributing in some way. I think what would worry me if I was a burden onto others. That's when my conscience might kick in.
For me, the big challenge is dementia. I think that I previously worked on some Alzheimer's research a long time ago, and neurology is a very, very tough area to research drugs in. It's probably the great last unknown, and we don't truly understand dementia, Alzheimer's, Parkinson's, epilepsy even. And that, for me, is something that there's no real causal link. Unfortunately, there are higher instances in certain populations, but it's going to be a real challenge because unless we can ensure quality happens, I don't know how we're going to cope with a population that gets older when we know that dementia will strike those at quite high rates. And I don't have that could be a real challenge because unfortunately, it's a very challenging thing to say, but cancer is quite finite in many conditions. So there is unfortunately a life expectancy generally associated to most types of cancer. Now in dementia, that's more challenging because you can live for a long period of time depending on the type of dementia. Not all dementias. That I think is going to be a real challenge. Now to your question and your point earlier, there is virtually no research being done that outside of Western Europe and North America. So it's going to be a really big issue as we go forward. And it will be an issue that unfortunately all the trials are only done in certain populations is going to skew the map of the world again.
So I'm married to a surgeon and he says 65 to 75, where I am, is Sniper Alley. you know, lots of your friends die or get terrible diseases, but the old are very interesting. You know, the people who survive, but the old. But I'm linking this to something that I know I bang on about a little, is I think it's almost scandalous that the last 5 or 6 governments have not done anything about social care, because a lot of what happens during old age is really boring stuff that people don't want to do. But Pauline, we need your country young to come over, I would say, because to help with this, but the financing mechanisms aren't there. Do you have any thoughts on financial allocation for care, you know, non-acute clinical care in old age? Come on, you're a philosopher.
I mean, I do. I mean, it's a baffling feature of the UK system. It's so much money goes on the NHS.
Yeah.
And so much, I don't know how to put it, so much social and civic pride goes into the NHS.
Well, it's
compared to
sexy,
social
yeah.
care, because it's sexy. And it's partly, look, but it's the same pattern you see in, let's say, the funding of treatment versus funding of prevention. So, you know,
yeah.
would we reduce, you know, if we can reduce ambulance time by a few seconds, of course we fund it. If we can put in some more traffic lights, who cares? And partly it's because it's sexy, but partly in that case, it's an out of sight, out of mind, because we don't really know whose lives are saved by traffic lights. They're kind of anonymous, you know, you can't sort of say, she would have died in a car accident if it weren't for the new traffic lights. So these kinds of anonymous statistical lives are always a problem in healthcare funding, because we're attracted to the identifiable, heroic case. That goes to treatment versus prevention. It also goes to social care, particularly in a society where you put people in care homes, where the care home is literally a place which is out of the system somehow. What that is an explanation of why we don't spend so much on social care, but in no way is it a justification, because it seems to me completely inconsistent. Yeah, I mean, I can't think of any reason you wouldn't treat social care and healthcare as parallel, entirely as part of the same system.
Rob, would you comment? Because you, as a GP, you must have seen
Yeah,
this.
it was a huge issue. I don't know under which government this was. I've been away for a while. Combining the budgets is a good thing. So that and localizing the budgets is a good thing, because you need to, because the map I showed earlier with it will be a different issue in London compared to Scotland compared to Cornwall. Now, I don't want to be too political, but devolving that responsibility, in my opinion, is a good thing. So there's been a good experiment. It's in Manchester. It's called Devo Mang, Devolve Manchester, where they've tried to combine all of these budgets together, and they've got some really interesting and good results. That is because they can localize and understand what's the benefit in each area. You can't do that at a national level. You just can't. It's so complicated. And again, everyone quotes that the NHS is it varies between the 3rd or 5th biggest employer in the world, next to Walmart and the Chinese army. So it is
Indian Railways as well.
Indian Railways, exactly. It is difficult to create funding change within those systems. But locally, if you could understand the locality, you can make change.
Yeah.
But it's complicated. My wife is a palliative care end of life doctor. Not much investment there either, but a huge area that we should. But you can only make those decisions when you have the information to know where the challenges are, and then allocate as needed. So I think combining the budgets and going to be a fan of one thing here for whoever's done it in the NHS. There's something called the ICSs and the ICBs, the integrated care systems. Good idea. Combine primary care linked to secondary care, linked to the budget owner that looks over the whole system. The challenge is, and I don't know the latest data or the numbers, most of those ICSs and ICBs are already in deficit.
They're broke. They're all broke.
And I know this is your expertise, Pam, so if I could ask you a question, given what you do, how do you solve that? I mean, there's people already sitting who are CEOs of those groups saying, I've got no funding available.
Well, it's interesting. I won't hog it, but we don't have the data. We don't have data and analysts really to the extent we need them. And it's a big productivity issue. Workforce has gone like that since COVID, or however that is, higher. And it's not as simple as it looks. They'll need a bailout, I think. But I was going to ask Julia about economic allocation, then we must have a break about this sort of area, like prevention. Quite right, governments don't tend to spend on it because it doesn't get them any votes. And I think possibly the same with social care, but what do you think about, because we should measure it, Julian, you're a measurement person.
Yeah. We should definitely be measuring it. And I definitely agree that we need to combine, or not necessarily combine the budgets, but at least get some cross-departmental thinking going about how different components fit together. And we all know, I mean, at the simplest level, not being in the health sector, but at the start of the pandemic, when there were reports of people sort of being pushed out of hospitals into care homes, and just a lack of joined up thinking about what the care home needs were compared to what the hospital needs were. And that happens the same way at a financial level. Getting the funding is, if I had the answer to that, I would be rich myself. I don't think there's a good answer. I think it's, again, it's a question of taxing. It's a question of, growing. If we can grow our economies, then we've got more money to spend on this. And realistically, in recent years, the UK economy has not had those level of growth we've had in the past, and that is a big challenge. Real incomes have been flat since 2010. So we've got a big issue there. I did just want to bring up one idea that I had come across, actually. So I do quite a lot of work with countries thinking about their climate change plans and thinking about their economies of the future, and countries often in the global south. And one country I was working with last year, I won't name the country, but they have great natural resources. And they were thinking about, okay, well, what's the economic value of those in the future? And many of you will know about carbon credits and the ways of keeping those. But then they thought, well, but we've got a large youth population. So what are the jobs related to that? There are only so many jobs in managing the forests. And one concept that I know was on the discussion table, I don't know how far it got in their planning, was, well, we could have the caring society here. We could have some hospitals for Europe's elderly here. We could offer 3-month cancer treatments for the elderly and bring them to this country. I'm not saying that that's a solution, because they have their own populations and we've got the whole world to think about. But I do think there are different mechanisms and different routes. Maybe someone would like to go and retire in a nice Pacific island and enjoy the protected natural land and rainforest that's being protected for future generations. And maybe that is where we should be thinking about doing things. So it's not just a question of migrating to the UK or increasing our workforce in caring here. It's also thinking more globally. How do we think about these issues, and what does that mean for different economies?
Oh yes, sorry, Pauline, go ahead. Say something positive or we'll slit our wrists.
I just wanted to bring it back home as well. I used to work for the UK's National Institute for Health Research. And I know they've now set up, as part of the local solutions, they've set up public and patient involvement and engagement branch. And so just to let you all know, if you're interested, they welcome people from the public and patients to contribute ideas to how they can better improve health and social care in the country. So if you have a chance, please volunteer and share your ideas. We're all in this together.
Thank you. So will you join me in thanking the panel?